Several early forms of serfdom emerged as far back as the 9th century in Russia. Individuals who were possessed by others as chattel property were referred to as cholopi. This word shares its root with other Slavic terms for man, boy, or person, and can still be found in modern words like człowiec, človek, or człowiek. A person could become a cholop by being captured in war, by selling themselves into servitude due to poverty, by being sold for debts, committing a crime, or even through marriage to another cholop. A cholop's master had unlimited power over their life. He could kill them, sell them, or transfer ownership to settle a debt. However, the master was also responsible for the cholop's actions, such as if they insulted a free man or committed theft, so keeping them tightly controlled was a matter of necessity. By 1723, Peter the Great enacted legal reforms that required the manumission, or buying out of bondage of all cholopi, particularly after the death of their owners. This gradual elimination of cholopstvo marked a shift, as these people were now moved onto permanent estates, a system paralleling another form of Russian serfdom called krepostnoye pravo. The word serf itself comes from the Middle French word, which is derived from the Latin servus, or slave. Serfs had a specific place within feudal society. In exchange for protection, a serf lived and worked on a plot of land within the lord's manor. In theory, this estate system had a degree of reciprocity. In practice, well, that's another story. Unlike cholopi, a lord could not sell his serfs directly, but if he chose to sell or dispose of the land, the serfs were bound to it and would now serve their new lord. Serfs were forbidden from abandoning their land without permission, nor did they possess any legal title to it. This form of Russian serfdom took root in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, becoming formalized under Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich. As tighter control over the movement of peasants was deemed necessary, laws were soon passed to prevent serfs from absconding to less controlled frontiers, enemy countries, or worse, more lenient landlords. In Western Europe, the devastation of the bubonic plague had resulted in such severe labour shortages that peasants, particularly in England, came into high demand. They gradually came to obtain some civil rights, along with reasonable wages, a degree of freedom of movement, and, most shocking of all, even the right to own property. This newfound freedom spurred entrepreneurial activity, increasing productivity and boosting national prosperity. But in Russia, deeply ingrained traditionalism, built on pious submission to authority, slowed any movement toward similar changes. Vast distances and the isolation of estates made it difficult for peasants to organize, though from time to time whole regions would erupt into rebellion, requiring entire armies to crush them. External invasions from all directions kept Russia in a near constant state of war readiness. Consequently, peasant rebellions, no matter how small, were treated as treasonous, with little sympathy from the monarchy. The barons, operating largely without royal oversight, subjected their serfs to brutal servitude, as well as arbitrary taxation, military service, and forced labour. Villages would often be left without men for months at a time, as the lords pressed them into military service. Yet the serfs were still required to pay rent and dues. Failure to do so often resulted in torture or punishment, which could even include the sale of their families, despite it being technically illegal. Eventually, whole villages were traded in open markets, gifted to other nobles, or sold to work in mines or on massive building projects. There were very few options for redress of abuse or injustice. One exception was an old tradition in some duchies that allowed a serf to leave an abusive master during the week of the Feast of St. George, though this opportunity came with an exit fee that few could ever afford. This problematic tradition was, of course, gradually extinguished, and laws criminalizing flight and harboring fugitive serfs soon followed. As the population expanded, doubling and then quadrupling in the 18th century, these land-bonded peasants became increasingly indistinguishable from cholopi, and sale markets once again sprang up across Russia to meet the demand for free labor. The monarchy often turned a blind eye to the abuses within the serfdom system, purely in exchange for loyalty from the barons. However, with Russia's population rapidly expanding, some rulers understood that showing concern for the peasantry might be a way to leverage their loyalty against the powerful and unruly barons. Peter the Great was perhaps the first to seriously consider this, and some of his legislation was aimed at limiting the hereditary privileges of the barons and church estates. He introduced a poll tax on serf households that bypassed the corrupt and predatory estate lords who were often responsible for tax collection. These reforms increased national revenue at the expense of reduced estate income, and they could have potentially led to the eventual abolition of serfdom altogether. Unfortunately, after Peter's death, many of these reforms were quickly repealed, and the burdens of the peasantry only intensified, leading to a cycle of uprisings, government paranoia, and then further repression. It wasn't until 1861 that Tsar Alexander II formally abolished serfdom. But in the meantime, rulers like Catherine the Great at least began to implement modest reforms that benefited serfs living on crown land or those under direct royal patronage. But again, we're getting just a little ahead of ourselves. So we return to Peter the Great's widow, Tsarina Catherine I, whose indulgent and decadent lifestyle saw her become so unhealthy in such a short time that she dropped dead of what we might today call diseases of affluence, barely 2 years into her reign. The inconvenient expiry of the Privy Council's puppet now opened a can of worms for the succession. Rival dynastic factions, descendants of Peter the Great's first and second wives, began squaring off, putting forward both female and male candidates for the throne. You'll recall that Catherine I was supposed to act as regent for her step-grandson, Peter II, the son of Peter the Great's treasonous son Alexei. But the Privy Council had other plans. They raised the boy in a carefree bubble of luxury, intentionally unprepared for the role of emperor, turning him into yet another puppet, while they stripped the treasury bare and brought the country to the verge of ruin. Unfortunately for the council, Peter II selfishly died prematurely of smallpox before he could marry and produce a new puppet for them. With his death, the direct male line of the Romanov dynasty was officially extinct. The council now scrambled to find another indolent sucker among the remaining female candidates. They eventually settled on Anna Ivanovna. You'll note the patronymic custom used to show lineage after the first name. Anna Ivanovna was already regent of the Teutonic Duchy of Courland, now part of modern Latvia, and she was a childless widow low on funds, perfectly positioned, or so they thought, to be a docile, compliant figurehead. The Privy Council made Anna an offer she couldn't refuse. They would make her Empress of Russia if she signed a decree vesting all executive power solely to the council. In effect, relegating herself to little more than a constitutional monarch. But within a year, Anna, surrounded by sycophants and possibilities, got stars in her eyes. Tearing up the contract, she sweet-talked her bodyguards, veterans of her father's beloved Preobrazhensky regiment, who on her behalf instigated a coup. The ministers of the Privy Council were unceremoniously ousted, and Anna now claimed full autocratic sovereignty. She was going full Olga on these bureaucrats. Turns out Anna, bless her, wasn't such a dummy after all. The newly empowered Tsarina formed a brand new council, staffed it with loyal ministers, and then sat back to let them handle affairs. But just to keep them in line, she found herself a virile young toy boy, made him a duke, and plopped him right into the centre of the Privy Council, where he caused a whole lot of headaches. I mention this because the tactic of setting your lover boy, like a cat among the pigeons inside the council, would become a staple move for future Russian queens. Of course, being the Queen's love stud was no picnic. You had to be at the top of your game, both under the sheets and in council espionage, as well as basically being a yes man to an already overindulged and paranoid tyrant. Fail at either, and you'd find yourself quickly replaced by a fresh favourite, or two, or maybe even three. Queen Olga would have been proud. But Tsarina Anna didn't stop there. She established a secret police bureau, with informants reporting directly to her. If you think the Soviet KGB was off the chain, Anna's agents employed public torture, murder, and banishment to Siberia on a scale that would have made Stalin proud. She single-handedly populated continental eastern Russia with convicts, settlers, on a scale that makes the British colonization of Australia look amateurish. In fact, some historians think she may have even been its inspiration. The Tsarina also formed a new bodyguards regiment to keep tabs on the ones who had installed her, just in case they got any ideas about doing it again. She also blew astronomical amounts of government cash on lavish building projects like there was no tomorrow. Many of the beautiful buildings and waterfront of St. Petersburg were initiated by her. The fact that Russia was now teetering on the edge of political and economic chaos was of no concern to her. For Anna, ignorance really was bliss. But as the treasury ran dangerously low, murmurings of discontent grew louder, despite the fear of Anna's secret police. On the other side of the family tree, Elizabeth Petrovna, Peter the Great's sole surviving daughter, was fuming at the wasteful expenditure occurring without any regard for the national interest. Elizabeth, too, had a claim to the throne that was widely considered legitimate, and she was most displeased with Anna's latest move. The Tsarina now decreed that the child of one of her own nieces was to inherit the crown, despite the girl not yet even being married, let alone having a child. So Elizabeth's supporters began plotting a coup against their now entrenched Tsarina. But they didn't have to wait long. Anna, like Catherine I before her, eventually died from overindulgence and good times. Despite her niece duly marrying and even giving birth to a son, proclaimed Tsar Ivan VI, the same Preobrazhensky guards that had installed Anna now promptly arrested both the child and his parents, with the full support of even Anna's own Izmailovsky guards. Elizabeth was soon installed as the new Tsarina, while the deposed infant Tsar Ivan VI would become Russia's very own tragic version of the Man in the Iron Mask. Imprisoned in solitary confinement from the moment he was weaned, Ivan would spend the next 2 decades in a dungeon, with no access to sunlight, human company, or education beyond Bible studies. He was known only as Prisoner Number 1 by guards who were unaware of his true identity, these being instructed to kill him if any attempt was made to free him. Truth, as they say, is stranger than fiction. It turns out that Elizabeth was even more cunning than Anna. Long before her coup, she had cultivated relationships with the guards regiments her father had created. She patronized their events, became godmother to many of their officers' children, and ensured the military would back her when the time came. In Russia, as in ancient Rome, the army was the key to survival, especially against the powerful aristocratic families dominating court. There was just one problem. Elizabeth was unmarried and childless. Her only fiancé had died shortly after their betrothal, and both her parents had passed away before arranging another suitable match. Her deceased sister, also called Anna, had married the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, a minor German noble family of little consequence, but solid international connections, and she did have a son, Karl Peter Ulrich of Schleswig-Holstein-Gottorp, who now became Elizabeth's main focus. Quickly repatriated to St. Petersburg, in 1742 Elizabeth proclaimed her 14-year-old nephew as Grand Duke Peter III, the Tsarevich, or Crown Prince, of all Russia. However, there was another problem. Peter didn't speak a word of Russian. Worse still, he despised the place and its people. Having been raised as a German, he was thoroughly entranced by all things Prussian, and, moreover, its king, Frederick the Great, was his idol. Nevertheless, Auntie Elizabeth gently persuaded her nephew that if he converted from Protestantism to the Orthodox Church, he would be an even greater king than Frederick. With the other pretenders safely locked up, and her own bona fide heir in hand, Elizabeth now set about completing her father's abandoned task of modernizing Russia. Under her reign, art, science, and fashion flourished. Elizabeth established Russia's first university and initiated Russia's literary golden age, starting with translations of foreign works, including the scandalous writings of Voltaire, with French soon becoming the official language of court communication. See our video on Voltaire for an account of his life and legacy. In the late 17th century, Sweden was the preeminent naval and military power in Northern Europe, controlling key territories around the Baltic Sea, including present-day Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and even parts of northern Germany. Russia, on the other hand, was largely landlocked, completely reliant on the White Sea in the Arctic for access to Western Europe, an area that was frozen for much of the year. Peter the Great, inspired by Western naval powers, was determined to gain a window to the west through the Baltic. To achieve this, he had engineered an alliance of continental powers, including his old enemy, Poland-Lithuania, as well as Denmark-Norway, both of whom resented Swedish domination and were also itching to grab a piece of the lucrative Baltic Sea trade. In the ensuing Great Northern War of 1700, both Denmark and Poland were quickly routed by Sweden's superior military might. But Russia, dogged and courageous, fought so fiercely that it soon inspired the Danes, Poles, and even the Prussians and British to rejoin the war on Peter's side. Under pressure from all fronts, Sweden decided to go after the ringleader, invading Russia from its recently won Polish-Lithuanian holdings, which extended all the way into the Ukraine. Plans were now set to march from this area straight to Moscow. The Swedes believed that defeating Russia would unravel the entire alliance against them, but, like so many invaders in Russia's history, they too soon found themselves victims of overextended supply lines, hit-and-run guerrilla tactics, as well as that most pernicious of enemies, the Russian winter. Severe blizzards decimated Swedish forces, leading to their complete annihilation at the Battle of Poltava in 1709. Sweden's time as a world power came abruptly to an end. It lost significant territory to the Russians, Poles, Danes, and Prussians in the process. As a result, Russia rebranded itself as an empire rather than a tsardom, taking much of the Baltic states and part of Finland as a prize. Russia wasn't just in business, it was now a boss. The shockwaves of victory at Poltava reverberated around the world, and suddenly everyone was paying attention to the Russians.